All right, everybody, welcome to part 2 of the iMessage build. My name is Shadi, and if you are new here, this is part 2 of a multi-part tutorial series that I am doing. So please check out part 1. It will be available somewhere at the top of the screen. Also, I have a Discord server where you can get direct access to me to ask any questions about the project or really to just chat about anything you would like. So please do join that. The link is in the description, and I would love to see you in there. All right, so just a quick recap. In part 1, we got all of the foundational parts of our project done, and we learned the fundamentals of all of the technologies that we are using. We got our front end completely set up using NextJS and Chakra UI, and we were able to set up our Apollo GraphQL client. And on our backend, we created our Apollo GraphQL server using Node and Express, and we learned the fundamentals of GraphQL. We learned about queries, mutations, resolver functions, schemas, type definitions, all of the GraphQL fundamentals. And we also set up our MongoDB database and learned the fundamentals of Prisma, and we added the custom username feature to our project. And with all of that stuff out of the way, we are now ready to start developing the more chat-centric, exciting features of our app. And so in this video, we are going to be working mostly on creating conversations with other users, and we are going to get a ton more experience with GraphQL, which is super exciting. So let's dive right in. All right, so since part 1, I got a new monitor, and it is significantly bigger than the monitor I was previously recording on. So I have a lot more screen real estate now. I don't know if you can notice on the video, but basically I have more room for the code. I have a bigger app window here, and I can just fit more stuff on the screen, which is super nice. I feel like I'm not in this very compact space. So I hope that this makes some sort of positive difference on these tutorials, because there's just more room. I have no idea if you can notice it, but if you can, cool. If you cannot, then whatever. Just pretend like I didn't say the last 30 seconds. Okay, so I realized that last time in part 1, I forgot a very small minor thing, and that was to use this loading state from our create username mutation to actually give loading state on the UI on that submit button, this one here, the save button. So we're just going to briefly add that. It is literally one line of code. All right, so to get back to that create username screen, what I'm going to do is just go to the database on this user that I'm currently signed in as and just delete the username. And then I'm just going to refresh, and it's going to bring us here. And I'm just going to open up the console here. Yeah, this is actually a lot nicer having this bigger screen. It makes a huge difference on my end. Because I just feel like I can do more things, like have a console open, and yeah, I don't know. We want to basically just add loading state to the save button here so that it indicates to the user that something is happening. And that's very easy to do because thankfully Apollo, with their beautiful React hooks, gives you this loading state here. And this in combination with the beautiful button component from Chakra, which is built to take in a stateful loading prop, is going to give us exactly what we want. So on the Chakra button, we can pass in a prop called isLoading, and this is going to be a Boolean, and the value we want to pass it is this loading state coming from the useMutation hook up here. So if I just set this equal to true, so we can see what this looks like, that is what that looks like. And I don't know, that just looks so nice to me. Like Chakra is just so satisfying to look at. I don't know about you, but I just love it. Okay, so let's set that to loading. And now we can see how that loading state is going to appear when this loading state changes from the useMutation hook. So for my user, I'm going to add the username Shadman and click save. You can see that loading state is super nice. And then we get brought back to the chat screen once that creation is successful. Okay, so I just wanted to briefly add that. That is one thing I missed from part 1, so my apologies, and now we can continue with the build. So I'm just going to actually close all of these files here, and we're sort of going to start from a clean slate for part 2 here. The first file I'm going to open up is going to be our index page, and the first feature we're going to focus very heavily on is creating conversations, and we're going to start working on the create conversation modal. So that modal that pops up where you can search for users and actually create a conversation with those users is what we're going to be working on first. So what we are going to do is create the skeleton component structure of our app. And then as we move along, we will build on top of each of these skeleton components here. But I want to sort of scaffold out the component structure so I can sort of lay out a clear direction for where we're going, and it might make the feature development more intuitive. So we already have these two main components here, auth and chat. And this chat component is really going to be sort of the entry point into the app after the whole authentication process. So this chat component is going to be the parent of, pretty much a lot of the functionality of our app. So I think I mentioned before that the way I like to build my React components is to try to keep them as clean and succinct as possible. I like to break it off into really intuitive pieces of logic, and that is sort of the logic that went into the component structure that we are about to build. All right, so let's come into our file explorer here. And inside of this chat folder, if you remember from a long time ago, maybe not, I don't even remember creating these, we created these two folders inside of chat, conversations and feed. And if you think about a chat, that's really all that you have. You just have, a conversation list, and then you have like a message feed. There's really only two governing components. So inside of our conversations folder, I am going to create a component called conversations wrapper.tsx. And I oftentimes create wrapper components to act as the main parent of a certain part of the application. And so this conversations wrapper is going to act as the main parent of really all of the conversation components, and it's going to contain some core logic that can be spread throughout these child components. And we are going to do the exact same thing for our feed. So inside of feed, I am going to create a component called feedWrapper.tsx. So let's come over to our conversations wrapper component and use the shortcut from the VS Code extension that we installed previously, tfcd, and we can save this. And I'm just going to change this to an interface rather than a type. I just prefer interfaces for prop types. So for now, I'm just going to leave these prop interfaces as empty. And then when we come back and actually build out these components, I will add the props into here. So inside of our feed wrapper, let's do the same thing. tfcd and convert this to an interface. Save this. And I actually don't think we need to import React from React as of React 17, which was a while ago. So I'm just going to delete these. I think this snippet needs to be updated. I should honestly just create my own snippet to do this, because this still does not make sense to me. Have a good coding. I mentioned this in my Reddit series. I thought it was funny how this is the default. It's kind of funny. I just kind of keep using it because it gives me a good laugh every time I see have a good coding. It just doesn't really make sense. Anyway, okay, so let's come to our conversations folder again, and we're going to create another skeleton component, and this component is going to be conversation list.tsx. So again, we can come in here and use our snippet, convert this to an interface, remove the React import, and save that, and we are good to go. Okay, so I'm just going to close our feed wrapper, close our conversation list, and close our conversation wrapper. So we are now back at our chat component here, and we are going to add in some of these skeleton components here to actually start building out the governing logic of our chat component. So rather than a div here, I am going to use a flex component from Chakra. And this is a new component we have not seen before. I don't think we've seen it in the part one, but essentially flex is just a box, but with flexbox already applied to it. So I do not need to manually declare the display as flex. It is already like that as it is, and we can add additional properties. And so we're basically building on top of flexbox with these components. And I honestly use the flex component a ton because I use Flexbox to pretty much style everything. And so yeah, it comes in handy. And this particular Flex container here is going to be the outermost div of our chat component. So we're going to give this a height of 100 VH, and VH here means viewport height. So we are saying that we want the height of this to be 100% of the viewport height. Okay, and I'm just going to actually go get rid of this username here. I think we had this in the index page. Yeah, we don't really need this. This is just for demonstration purposes. All right, and for those of you that do not know what the viewport is, it essentially is represented by the entire window that the user can see. So right now, this particular gray area is the viewport. So just to quickly demonstrate what this looks like, I'm just going to add a quick border to this, 1 pixel solid red, and you can see that that is the area we talked about. So if I expand this, it is dynamic, and it always is going to be 100% of the viewport height, no matter what the size is. And I always use borders when I'm building out any sort of HTML structure. I find it is like the console logs of CSS and HTML, and it really helps me visualize the layout of things. So I recommend you to do that as well. It's like little construction lines, which is nice. Now inside of this flex, I'm going to get rid of this chat text, and I am going to add in our conversations wrapper component. And as a sibling to this, I'm going to add our feed wrapper component, just like that. And I'm going to remove this logout button because we are going to add that to a different component in a little bit here. All right, so we have two have a good codings because those are coming from here. So I'm just going to come back into here and change this to conversations wrapper, so we actually know what we're looking at. And let's change the feed to be that as well. Feed wrapper. Okay. So let's come back to our chat component here. And the only other thing we're really going to add to the HTML of this component is going to be a context provider for our createConversation modal. And we're going to look at how to use React context to create state that is shared across multiple components. But I will speak more about that when we get to it. But as for the structure of this component, this is pretty much it. And actually, let's declare the props for this component. So I'm just going to call this chat props. Remove the I. And this component is only going to take in a single prop, and that is going to be our user session. And we can import this type from NextAuth. Then down here in the props, I'm just going to destructure the session. And we are going to pass this session as a prop to both of these components here. And you'll notice that in our index page here, TypeScript is getting mad because we have declared the session as a prop, but we are not passing it. So let's just go ahead and do that. TypeScript is happy now. Okay, and actually we might as well just pass the session to both of these components now. So I'm just going to say session is equal to session, and same thing down here. And TypeScript is mad because we have not declared the session as a prop on our prop types here. So for our conversations wrapper, we can do the same thing. Declare the session. The type of that is going to be session from NextAuth. Save that, and come over to our feed wrapper interface and do the same thing. And make sure this imports from NextAuth. And then in both of these, we can destructure the session, just like this. Perfect. Just gonna close my directory here so I have some more room. Awesome. Okay, so I think that's it. TypeScript is happy and we can keep moving. All right, so I just realized that for the first part of this tutorial, I was not quite zoomed in enough on my VS Code. So I do apologize for that. I'm still getting used to this monitor. Please do comment below if there's any changes to the production of these videos that I can make that would make them better. Okay, so we kind of have the skeleton of our application built out, and obviously there's going to be many, many more children components that we are going to need to create as we build out our app. But these components that we have created sort of represent a very high level structure of our app. And I personally find that when I just spend a little bit of time thinking about the structure of my components and think about them from this more skeleton point of view like we have done so far, I find that it just slows down my thinking a bit, and it just gets me thinking about things from more of a bird's eye view and sort of from more of an engineering standpoint rather than just jumping in and trying to create something as fast as possible. And I personally find that to be really helpful, and I hope you do as well. I hope that it makes the development of our app a bit more intuitive. Okay, so what we're going to do now, so now we have enough of a skeleton set up where we can actually go ahead and start creating that conversation modal. So I'm going to go to Google and just search up modal Chakra UI and just go into this documentation here. And if you just scroll down, we're basically just going to create one of these. I'm just going to expand this out a bit. We are pretty much going to be doing exactly this, and then we're just going to be modifying the inside content of the modal. But they make the opening and closing logic of the modal very, very easy, and they provide us with a very nice component. So that is super nice. So I'm just going to expand this back here. And this modal component is actually going to live inside of that conversation list component that we created that we haven't really done anything with. And the reason that it's going to be in here is because we are going to define some functions in here that are going to be passed to that modal. And this conversation list component is going to be a child of our conversation wrapper component. So let's go ahead and start developing out the HTML of our wrapper component. And I'm just going to go back to the app over here. We'll come back to the modal docs when we actually need to grab that code. So inside of our conversations wrapper component, we can get rid of this div, and we are going to instead return a box component. So make sure that imports from Chakra. And inside of this box is where that conversation list component is going to live. So we can import that conversation list. And we are also going to pass the session to this conversation list component. And in order to do that, we are going to need to declare that on the conversation list props. So on the interface here, let's come in here and just declare that. So let's come back to our wrapper component here. And eventually inside of this conversations wrapper component, we are going to add a GraphQL query that is going to fetch all of this user's conversations. And that query is going to have a loading state given to us by the useQuery hook. And we are going to use that loading state to display a skeleton loader component inside of this box here. So we are going to add that component later when we actually create the query. But for now, I'm just going to add a comment that says skeleton loader so that we know that it's going to be there. Okay, so let's add some CSS properties to this box. So let's start off with the width. Now the width of this component is going to need to be responsive. On mobile screen sizes, we are going to want the width to be 100% of the screen size. And on medium screen sizes, we are going to want it to be 400 pixels. So we are going to need to use media queries so that we can add responsive styling. And so the way we can do media queries in Chakra is for a specific CSS property, such as our width here, we can pass in an object. And inside of this object, we can indicate what we want the value of the width to be at different screen sizes. And since we are doing mobile first development, we are going to start off with mobile screen sizes. And in Chakra, a mobile screen size is referred to as base. So we're basically saying here that on base screen sizes or mobile screen sizes, we want the width of this to be 100%. And then we are going to add a breakpoint. And at medium screen sizes, we are going to want to change the width of this to be 400 pixels. And if you are curious what the actual pixel values of these breakpoints are, you can just Google Chakra breakpoints probably. And yeah, so it'll bring you to this section called responsive styles. And then it shows you what the default breakpoints are with Chakra out of the box. And so you can customize the breakpoint values if you want in your Chakra theme.ts file. But for this tutorial, it's not super important and the default ones work just fine. So we're not going to touch that and we're just going to use the default ones. But I did want to mention how you can see what these actual pixel values are. But yeah, in Chakra, this is how you can add breakpoints and responsive styling to certain CSS properties of your components. So I'm just going to close this and come back to our app here. All right, and while we are developing this out, let's actually add a border here so we can see what we're creating. So you can see that the width of this container is currently 400 pixels because this current window size is satisfying the medium screen size breakpoint. So basically anything medium and above, it is going to be 400 pixels. And then if we go all the way down to a base screen size, you can see that the width goes to 100%. And later on, when conversations actually exist and we can go into those conversations, we are going to add some additional logic here that is going to show and hide these components accordingly, depending on if we are viewing a conversation. But that is not really important right now, and we will come back to that. Okay, so the next property we're going to add to this box is going to be a background color. So we can say BG, and the value is going to be whitealpha.50. We can save that, and it's going to be a little bit lighter than our feed. Okay, and I'm just going to remove this box because we can kind of see with that background what this component actually is. And so now we are going to add some top and bottom padding, and that can be achieved by using the py prop. Py is basically short for padding in the y direction, so up and down. We are going to make this a value of 6, and then px, which is going to be the horizontal padding, we are going to make 3. Okay, so we are now ready to actually go into our conversation list component and start creating the conversation modal. So let's come into our file explorer here, and inside of our conversations component folder, I am going to create another folder called Modal. And this is going to contain our actual modal and all of the child components that our modal is going to have. And then inside of our modal, I am going to create a component called Modal, and that's going to be the main parent of all of the other child components that we are eventually going to create in here. So let's use our snippet, tfcd, convert this to an interface, remove the React import, and we can save that. And this is where we're going to put that modal code from the Chakra UI docs in a second here. So I'm just going to close the directory, come back to conversation list. Okay, and I'm just going to remove this div here, and we are going to add in a box from Chakra. This box is going to have a width of 100%. And inside of here, we are going to add another box. And inside of this inner box here, we are going to add some text to make sure text imports from Chakra UI. And this is going to be the component that a user can click on to open the conversation modal. So this is going to say find or start a conversation. And let's add some CSS properties to this box. So you want to add a padding Y of 2, a padding X of 4, a margin bottom of 4, a background of black alpha 300, a border radius of 4, and we want the cursor to be pointer. And then we are eventually going to add an onClick that is going to open the modal once we actually have that function available to us. So now you can see that that is starting to look more like we saw in the demo. And then on this actual text, we are going to center it. So we can say text line is equal to center. And we are going to give this a color of white alpha 800. And we're going to bold it a bit. So we're going to give it a font weight of 500. Awesome, and that is looking really nice. And so now we can add our modal component as a sibling of this box component here. So just underneath this, let's add our conversation modal component. And I'm calling this conversation modal to be a bit more clear in the code. And so since the name we are giving this component is different than the file name, React is not auto-importing it. So let's just come up to the top here and import conversation modal from modal/modal, just like that. Okay, so now let's come into our modal component here and actually put in the code from the Chakra documentation. So let's come over to the Chakra docs, and I'm just going to grab the return statement of this component because we don't really need the other stuff. Paste that in here. All right, and it is freaking out because we have not imported any of this stuff. So let's come over here. I'm going to press Command period and click on Add All Missing Imports. And so you can see that there is some other stuff that has a red underline here, and these are basically just the onClick functions that are going to toggle the open state of this modal. And this other one over here, this isOpen property, is the modal state itself. So we are going to need to declare some React state that is going to need to represent the openness of this modal. So for now, I'm just going to remove both of these because we're going to declare that in a second here. And we can remove this button completely. We're not going to need that. And we're not going to need a modal footer at all for our case, so we can just remove that. And let's come to conversation list. Now we need to declare some sort of state that is going to control whether or not our modal is open. And we're going to need to create some functions that are going to be able to actually toggle that state. And we are going to declare that state inside of our conversation list component here. And the reason we are declaring the modal state inside of conversation list and not inside of the modal component directly is because we are going to need access to the modal state and the open and close functions in other logic and other components of this conversation list component. So that is why we're going to declare the state in the conversation list component and then pass it as props to our conversation modal. So at the top of our conversation list component, let's declare that state. So isOpen and setIsOpen. And we can use the useState hook from React. And by default, we want this to be false. Okay, and underneath this, we are going to create two functions. One is going to open the modal, and the other is going to close the modal. So the first one is just going to be called onOpen, and all we're going to do in this function is call setIsOpen and set it equal to true. And underneath here, we can create onClose, and this is going to say setIsOpen to be false. Okay, and as I mentioned before, it is this find or start conversation box that we want to actually open the modal when we click on it. So we can change this onClick here to be onOpen, just like that. And in order to open and close this modal, we are going to need to pass a few props to our conversation modal. So our first prop is going to be isOpen. And so the value of this is going to be our isOpen state declared on line 11 there. And the second prop is just going to be our onClose function. So we can say onClose is equal to onClose, just like that. And we have not declared these two props on our modal props interface here. So let's come in here and declare them. So isOpen is going to be a Boolean, and then we can declare our onClose function. And the type of this is just going to be a function that returns nothing or void. And this is how you can declare that in TypeScript. Then inside of our props here, we can destructure isOpen and onClose. And now to actually make this modal happy, we can say isOpen is going to be the value of our isOpen state prop. And then onClose, we can say onClose. So there's a name conflict here. We called our component modal, but the component from Chakra is also called modal. So we're just going to change the name of our component to be conversation modal. That is why I had it named differently over here, in case you were wondering, because there was a name conflict with that, with the Chakra modal. And we can rename it down here, just like that. And then we can just simply import modal from Chakra. Yeah, that is why it did not import initially. Okay, let's go back to our app here and just refresh because I think something was super broken. Open up the console. Okay, so now I should actually be able to open and close this modal, which is really, really cool. So this find or start a conversation is actually toggling that isOpen state. And we can actually see that in real time in the React Chrome extension here. For those of you that do not have the React Chrome extension, I highly recommend you to install it. It is extremely useful in debugging your React applications. So if I just use the select tool and we can search for the conversation list component, you can see that there is this value of state in here, and this is our isOpen modal state. So you can see when I click on find or start a conversation, that toggles to true. And then when I close it, that close function is called and it puts it to false. open puts to true, close to false. I highly recommend you to install this extension. It's super, super useful. And right now, this is just a basic use case of it. But when your application gets a lot more complicated, you can see all of the props and the values of those props in all of your components, and you can track all of the state. It's really, really nice. And the more advanced your project gets, the more useful this tool becomes. Okay, so let's go back to the console here. And so now that we actually have a conversation modal to open, we can start to build out the content of this modal. Okay, so let's go inside of our conversation modal here. And the first thing we are going to work on is going to be the input where users can search for other users to create conversations with. So we are going to create a form with an input as well as a submit button. Okay, so we are going to start off by modifying the background color of our modal to match our app theme. So I'm just going to add on this modal content here a BG of 2D, 2D, 2D. Okay, so it's a nice gray color that is similar to our app theme. And I'm also going to add a bottom padding of 4. All right, now let's come down to our modal body here, because this is where everything we are going to add is going to go. And the first thing we are going to add in here is going to be the form that is going to be responsible for searching for users. Inside of our form here, we are going to add a stack component from Chakra. And I think this is the first time we have seen stack. Stack is very similar to the flex component. Stack already has flexbox applied to it. However, it is by default in the column direction, and the stack component is going to apply equal vertical spacing between all of its children. So the stack component literally creates a stack of components, and that'll make more sense as we actually build this out. The first component in our stack is going to be an input from Chakra, so make sure that imports, and the second one is going to be a button. So when we save that, you can see that this input and the button are stacked vertically, and there is this spacing in between them. And if I were to add another few buttons, for example, you can see that this is what the stack looks like, just a bunch of child components that are spaced evenly in the vertical direction. And this spacing can be adjusted, which we are going to do. You can do that by adding a spacing property to the stack, and we're just going to increase it. I think the default is 2, so we're just going to increase it a little bit to 4. Okay, on our input, we are going to have a placeholder that says enter a username. We're going to prompt users to search for users by entering a username. And we are going to need to create some state to make this a controlled input. And the value of that state is going to be the username that the user is searching for. So up at the top of our component here, I'm going to create that state, username, set username. And we're going to bring in the useState hook. And the default value is just going to be an empty string. Okay, now to connect this state to our input, we can make the value of our input that username state. And then we want to add an onChange function to actually update that state when the user types into the input. So onChange, we are going to take the change event and set username to be the text value inside of that event. And we can do that as follows. And this username state is what is going to be sent to our GraphQL API so that our backend can actually perform the search on our database. Okay, and we're seeing this error in the console here. What is this? A component is changing an uncontrolled input to be controlled. Okay, maybe we just have to refresh here. Okay, yeah, so I'm not too sure. There's just some sort of sometimes you get these weird like hot reload compiler errors in your console with UI libraries. And just as another quick tip about the React extension to make sure your state is actually working, if you want to just quickly use the select tool and find the conversation modal, you can see the username state here. Unfortunately, this extension does not say the name of the state. It's kind of annoying when you have like 10 state variables, you don't know which one's which. One thing that is nice is that they appear in the same order in here as you have them defined in your code. Right now we only have one, so it's not too bad. But anyway, currently it's an empty string, but if I start typing in here, you can see that that updates. So we do have a stateful component here, which is great and exactly what we want and need. So let's go back to our console and keep on moving. Okay, so let's come down to our submit button here and start styling this thing. Okay, so we are going to add a type of submit here so that it connects to our form. And we are also going to disable this button if there is no username in the input. So we are going to make the value of disabled a Boolean, and that is going to check for the existence of a username string. So this is basically going to disable the button if the username is empty. And I just realized that our button should not be self-closing, so we can remove the self-closing tag and add the actual closing tag so we can put some text into here. And inside of our button, we are just going to add the text search. Awesome. So now you can see that it has this sort of grayed out look. And if I hover over it, we can see that it is disabled. And if I type, you can see that it sort of lights up because it checks for the existence of a username before it is going to allow us to submit. So the one thing our form is currently missing is an onSubmit function. So when we either click on the submit button or when we press enter, we need the form to do something. You can see that by default, it just refreshes the page, which we are going to fix in a second here. Okay, so let's go ahead and define that function. So I'm just going to come up here and create a function called onSubmit. And this is going to be an asynchronous function because it is going to communicate with our backend. And inside of here, this is where we are going to perform our search users query. So I'm just going to add a comment, search users query. And I don't believe we have created this yet. I'm going to check on our operations folder for our user. Yeah, so we have not created the search users query yet. I think on the backend we did. If we look at our resolvers, I think we defined, so we defined it in our resolvers and probably our typeDefs as well. Search users. Yeah. Okay. So the backend's already sort of set up for it. But on the front end, we need to define that query string here, which we are going to do very shortly here. Let's close these out. But yes, in this onSubmit function is where we are going to actually perform the search users query using this username state. And that query is going to return us a list of users that satisfy the search. And then we are going to display those users in the HTML of this component and then allow the user to select them and then create a conversation with those selected users. So that is the direction we are going in for this component. So let's actually hook this onSubmit function up to our form here. So we can say onSubmit is equal to our onSubmit function. So now when we submit this form, this function is going to be called. Okay, so if I come up here and just add a console log inside onSubmit and we log the username, if we open up our modal here and I type something, if I submit it, okay, yeah, we need to prevent the default behavior of the form, which is to refresh the page. So the way we can do that is by taking an event as an argument here, and the type of this event is going to be react.form event. And the very first thing we want to do inside of our function is call event.preventDefault, and that is going to prevent it from refreshing the page when we submit the form. So if I come back in here and search for Shadi, if I press enter, you can see that we are entered into the onSubmit function and the username value is displayed there. I can either submit the form by pressing enter or by actually clicking search. So we can test that out, and the console log is working and the refresh behavior has been stopped due to this function call here. And actually, to make this more clear, I'm going to call our onSubmit function onSearch. It is a better name in my opinion. OnSubmit is equal to onSearch. So now we can actually start to work on the search users query and send this username to our backend so that we can actually get some search results. So as we just saw, the backend is pretty well set up for our search users query. We have to write out the resolver to actually search the database, but the boilerplate code is there for it. So now we need to work on the front end side of our search users query. So what we are going to do is come to our user operations file, user.ts, and this is on our front end. And we are going to define that query string inside of the query section of this object here. So let's come inside of our queries object here, and we want to create a query called search users. And the value of this is going to be a GraphQL string. So we can use GQL and open up the set of backticks. And we are going to be creating a query here. So we are going to use the keyword query. The query name is going to be search users. And this query is going to take in this username state as an argument. So inside of our query here, we can declare that input very similar to basically what we are doing down here with our create username mutation. We can say $username, and this is going to be of type string. And we're going to add the bang operator to make it required. Open up a set of curly brackets. Inside of these curly brackets, we need to indicate to our backend what resolver we actually want to hit when we perform this query. And the name of our resolver is search users. And we want to declare our username argument, and the value of this is going to be the username that is passed into our query. And now we can declare what fields we actually want returned to us from our API. And in part one, I discussed how one of the advantages of GraphQL over REST is how you can query for the specific fields that you want your backend to return to you, depending on what exactly is relevant in the query or mutation you are writing. And we do not have to fetch the entire entity. Now, in our case, when we are searching users, we only really need our search results to contain two user properties. And those two properties are going to be the ID as well as the username. That is literally all the user information that we need on our front end to successfully search for users and to create conversations with these users. Therefore, that is all we are going to query for. All right, so we are done with this query. So let's save this and let's come back to our modal over here. And since we have a query defined now, we can actually start writing out the logic to actually perform this query. Now, in order to actually perform this query, we can bring in the useQuery hook from Apollo React. So let's come up to the top here and actually call our useQuery hook. And that is going to return an object. So we can say useQuery and import this from Apollo client. And as an argument, we want to pass in this search users query string. So we are going to need to import our user operations inside of our modal here. So at the top, we can say import user operations. And I think we need to go up about 3 or 4 directories here. Yeah, so into GraphQL and then /operations/user. Then down here in the useQuery hook, we can pass in that query string. So we can say user operations.queries.searchUsers. And now this hook is going to return an object to us. And inside of that object, we are going to have those 3 properties. So we're going to have data, loading, as well as an error. So there is one small problem with the way we have written this out. The way the useQuery hook works is that it is going to fire as soon as this component renders. And we don't really want to do that if you think about it. We don't want to open up the modal and just immediately search for users because there is no username input. The user hasn't actually entered a username that they want to search for. So it doesn't really make sense to fire this query as soon as the component renders. We only want to fire this query when the user actually submits this form. So we need a bit more control over how and when this query is going to fire. Okay, now luckily this is not an uncommon thing, and Apollo has another hook that we can use to do exactly this. And this hook that I am talking about is called useLazyQuery. And so the difference between useQuery and useLazyQuery is that useQuery fires as soon as your component renders, and useLazyQuery is going to allow you to choose exactly when this query is going to be fired rather than just on component render. And you'll notice that this is kind of freaking out over here because the return value for useLazyQuery is slightly different than useQuery. UseLazyQuery is going to return us an array, and the first value in the array is going to be a function that is going to allow us to call this query, and the second argument is going to be that object with data, error, and loading inside of it. And so this function here is what we are going to need to call to execute this query. And so you can see how the LazyQuery hook gives you this function to give you more control over when this query is going to be executed. Now, before we call our search users function, let's go ahead and make sure that this query is actually going to be type safe by adding in our TypeScript generics to this hook. So let's go into our front end types file here in the util folder. And this is where we are going to define those types. So just as a reminder, we are going to need to define 2 types here. The first one is going to be our input type, and the second one is going to be our data type. And again, the data type represents the structure of the data that is actually coming back from our backend. So let's first create our input interface. So we can say export interface search users input. And the only single input we have for this particular query is going to be a username, and that is going to be of type string. Underneath here, let's create that second interface, and this is going to be called search users data. So this represents the structure of the data that is being returned to us from the API. So the data that our API is going to return is going to look like this. There's going to be a search users key, and the value of this is going to be an array of users. But if you remember from our query string, if we go into our user operations, it's not going to be the entire user entity. The returned users are only going to have an ID and username because that is all we are asking for in the search users query. So the type of the entities that are going to be inside of this array are only going to have those 2 properties, an ID as well as a username, and they are both going to be of type string. So essentially what this means in human English is that the search users query is going to return to us an array of objects, and those objects are going to have a ID property and a username property. Now, to be a bit more clear and make our code a bit more readable, I'm going to strip that type out and declare a separate type for it. So I'm going to come down here and create an interface called searched user, and the value of that is going to be this ID and username, and then inside of this array we can declare that. So we are saying that the search user's data is going to contain an array of searched user. And it makes sense to declare a separate type for this because the searched user type is not at all the same as a user type. The actual user type has way more fields than just this. We are creating a custom type here specifically for our search functionality. And again, as I mentioned and emphasized in part 1, we want to create TypeScript types that are an accurate representation of our GraphQL types. And our GraphQL type for this particular returned entity is going to have only an ID and username. Therefore, our TypeScript type must also reflect that. And so that is why we are creating this separate searched user interface. Okay, so let's go back to our Modal component and add these type interfaces into our useLazyQuery. So the first interface we are going to pass here is going to be our search users data, and the second one is going to be our search users input. So make sure those two things import from our util types file there. And so now TypeScript is going to know the structure of data when it comes in, and it is going to know what input variables we need to pass to our search users function. And so now down here, we can actually call that function. So let's remove this comment. And all we are going to need to do is call search users and pass in that username as a variable. And so you can see that TypeScript knows what input to expect thanks to our new interfaces. So we can do that, and that is it. That is all we need to do. We can remove this comment here. And actually, we don't really need to declare this function as asynchronous. And yes, this search users function is asynchronous because it is sending a request to our API. But the asynchronicity, is that a word? Asynchronicity? The asynchronous nature of our search users function is going to be handled by our useLazyQuery hook. Because if you remember, we have this loading state, and as it is loading and the asynchronous request is still pending, loading is going to be true, and then it's going to update to false once the data actually comes in. So we don't really need to make this function asynchronous technically because we're not using the await keyword in here. That is literally all this function is going to be. So now when the user submits the form, onSearch is going to be called, which is going to call our search user query function. That is going to make the request to our API, and then our backend is going to return the search results, which are going to be accessible in this data object here. So then we are going to use this data object in the HTML of this component to actually render the search results to our user on the UI. So now I think we are ready to go to our backend and write out the search users resolver so that we can actually get some real data on our front end here. So let's go into our user resolvers file. And now we are back on our back end. And to make sure we are actually hitting this function, let's just add a console log here that says inside search users. So when I submit this form, we should see this console log here. And this log is going to appear in the terminal here on our backend server. Okay, so let's try submitting this form. Hey dude, click search, and you can see that we are successfully making it inside of our search users resolver. So we can go ahead and write out the logic for this now. Now, as we talked about in part 1, every single GraphQL resolver receives these same arguments, these things here. And the ones we are interested in mostly are args and context. So we can copy and paste these and declare them as the inputs to our search users function here. And the type of our args for search users is going to actually be the exact same as create username. It's just going to take in a single input, and that is going to be the username. And this TypeScript type for our arguments matches both the type we declared in our typeDefs here. We declared for the search users query, the username argument. And on our front end, if we go to user operations, we just wrote this a second ago, we declared the username input here as well. So in the resolvers function, this matches perfectly with our front end and GraphQL types. Okay, so let's write out the logic of this resolver function here. So we are going to grab the username off of our args, so we can destructure args. I'm going to grab the username, and I am going to alias our username to be called searched username because we're going to have another username variable down below in a second here. And we are going to destructure our context so that we can grab our user session as well as the Prisma client. Now we want to secure this resolver against unauthenticated users, just like we did down here in our create username mutation. So we can say if there is no session.user, we are going to want to throw a new error. And in order for this error to be caught by our Apollo server, we can specifically throw an Apollo error. And Apollo is going to automatically catch this error and then return it to our front end. And then as an argument, we can just pass the error message. And in this case, we're just going to say not authorize. And this is just another way we can handle errors in our Apollo server. Down here, you saw in the create username mutation that we were handling it a little bit differently. We were returning an object with an optional error message on it. These are just two different ways you can handle errors. I personally prefer this method up here. I did want to show you how to do both because sometimes it's nice to be able to return custom error messages. Which one you use kind of depends on the use case. Sometimes you want a little bit more control over your error handling, so you maybe want to, add the error to your return type, like we did here. And then sometimes it's just enough to just simply throw an error and then that will be forwarded to your client. Really, it doesn't matter too much. It's just a preference on how you like to do your error handling. I personally prefer this method here since Apollo is just going to, out of the box, handle the errors for us. So if we make it past this if statement here, that means the user is signed in. What we're going to do is grab the username of the currently signed in user. So we can destructure that from our user session, just like this. And I am going to alias this to be my username because this is the username of the user that is making this request. Now, the reason we are interested in this user's username is because when we query our database below to search for users with the inputted username, we do not want to include the currently signed in user, right? I don't really need to search for myself. I already know I exist and I don't want to create conversations with myself, although I do that sometimes in real life. But in this app, we are going to assume you do not want to create conversations with yourself. So in our database query, we are basically just going to add a condition to exclude ourselves from the search. So now we can actually write out the query to our database to search for these users. So I'm going to create a try catch block, and let's start off with our catch block down here. If an error occurs when we are querying our database, we are just going to console log search users error so we can see the error. And then we are just going to throw a new Apollo error with the message from the error, just like that. Okay, and then we can just declare this as type any. And inside of our try block is where we're actually going to query our database using Prisma. So we can create a variable called the users, and these are the users that Prisma is going to return to us from our database. So we're going to want to call our Prisma client, and that is asynchronous, so we are going to need to await that. And we are querying our user model, so prisma.user, and the function we are going to want to call here is find many, because we are going to be returning all users whose username includes this search username search term. Okay, and I think this is complaining because, yeah, we forgot to declare this function as asynchronous. So let's add the async keyword there, because we can only use the await keyword inside of asynchronous functions. Okay. Now, inside of our find many function, we can pass an object. So we want to tell Prisma to find all users where the username contains this search username input. So here's how we can do that. We can say where username, and then we can use the contains keyword from Prisma, and we want to see if the username contains searched username. And as I said before, we do not want to include ourselves in the search. So to tell Prisma to exclude our own username from the search, we can say where the username is not our own username. So username is not my username. And we can also add a mode condition here to make this case insensitive so that the user does not necessarily have to type in the exact casing of the user's actual username. So that is it for our query. And now all we need to do is just return these users to our front end. So we can just say return users. And we can actually specify the return type of this function here. And this function is going to return a promise because it is asynchronous, and the resolved data inside of this promise is going to be an array of users. And thankfully, Prisma generates TypeScript types for all of our database models when we run that npx prisma generate command. And that is super handy because we can use those types in our TypeScript code if we need them. And even though we are returning our full user entity here, only the ID and the username of the user are going to be passed from our API back to our client because that is all we are querying for. Because if you remember on our client, if we go to our user operations, we are only querying for the ID and username. And if we go to our backend typeDefs for our user, we have declared the search users query to return an array of users, and the structure of this user only has an ID and username. And actually, to be more proper, this should be declared as a searched user and not an actual user because this is not the structure of our user. And we want search users to return an array of searched user, just like this. So even though our TypeScript function is returning the full entity, only these two fields are going to be passed through the network. Okay, so we can close this out and save this. And that is it for our search users resolver function. And we should now be able to successfully search for users from our front end and get an array of users who match the search term. Okay, so I'm just going to open up Mongo Compass so we can see what users are actually in our database. So we can test this to make sure it is working. So let's go to the users collection here. Zoom in a bit. So we can see that there are 3 users and the usernames are Shadbud, LolDude, and Shadman. So let's make sure our server is like running and everything. Okay, yeah, so it's successfully running, front end is fine. And actually before we test this out, let's go back to our modal and add the loading state to our button here. So we can take this loading state and pass this as the isLoading prop to our button. IsLoading is equal to loading. And let's come up here and add a console log so we can see the value of the data that comes back from our search users function. So here is search data. We want to see data. And let's just refresh the page here to clear the Apollo cache. Okay, and let's clear the console again. And let's search for Dua. Okay, so this returned an array of 0 users, which makes sense because our database has no users that satisfy that requirement. But if I search for Shad, we should get 2 users returned to us. And actually, I think I'm currently signed in as Shadbud, so it will not return myself because we excluded that from the search. So it should only return this user here, Shadman. So let's click search. And if we open this up, we can see there is an array of 1. And yeah, it successfully returned that user, Shadman. Okay, and yeah, once again, I am signed in as Shadbud, and that is why Shadbud is not included in these search results. Only Shadman is. And I can search for lol, click search, and open up that latest log here. And you can see LolDude was returned to us. Awesome. So our search is working successfully. And the next step would be to actually take those search results and create some sort of UI component that can allow the user to select those users and create a conversation with those users. And before we do that, let's just change our modal title to something more meaningful rather than just modal title. We're going to change this to create a conversation. Much better. So what we want to do is create a component that is going to take the users inside of this data object and render them on the UI. So in our Explorer here, inside of Modal, let's create a new component, and this component is going to be called UserSearchList.tsx. Close the directory here, and we can use our snippet tfcd, do our usual routine here, changes to an interface, remove the React import, and save that. So this component is going to take in 3 props eventually, but for now we're only going to focus on 1, and that 1 is going to be the users from our search results. So we can call this users, and this is going to be an array of searched users. So we can import that type from our util types like that, and then we can come down here and just destructure the users here. And then inside of this div here, just temporarily, let's just render the length of the users array or something. So this will just be a number for now, just so we can make sure that this is working. And now let's go back to our modal, and just underneath our form here, this is where we are going to render our user search list. And we need to pass in a value for our users prop. And the value of this is going to be our data.searchUsers, because this is going to be the array of users returned from our API. And you'll notice that TypeScript is complaining here. It is saying that an array of searched users or undefined is not assignable to type searched user. Inside of our search user list, we have declared this as always being the type of an array of searched users. However, because this data is initially going to be undefined, TypeScript is saying, well, sometimes users is therefore going to be undefined, and you have not declared it that way, so this is not allowed. And what we can do is just prevent this component from being rendered at all unless the search users array actually exists. And so the way we can do that is we can say data.searchUsers and use the double ampersand sign like this. And if you have not seen this before, this is essentially how we can conditionally render things in React based on some condition. And so we're saying if there is a truthy value at data.searchUsers, let's show this user search list. And because this is only going to render if data.searchUsers is a truthy value, we actually do not need optional chaining here, because we know for sure it is going to exist because that is exactly what we are checking for here. And now TypeScript is happy because the types line up users is going to be an array of search users, just like we are declared over here. Okay, so let's do a quick search here. So let's just search for Shad and let that load. And you can see that it displays a length of 1, just because we have temporarily rendered the length of the data that has been returned from our API. Okay, I'm just going to zoom in once on the console here, just to make it a little bit bigger. So now we can actually build out the HTML of this component here. So let's get rid of this div. And instead, we are just going to have a React fragment. And inside of this fragment, we are going to have a ternary operator that is going to check if the user's array has a length greater than 0. If it does, then we are going to show those users in the form of a UI component. And if not, we are going to show a different component that says no users found. So here is how we can write this out. We can say users.length is equal to 0 ? If that is true, then we want to show a component that is going to say no users found, telling the user that their search was not successful in finding any users. And if users.length is not equal to 0, which is the falsy case of this ternary operator, we want to show those actual users. And those are going to be rendered inside of a stack component, which we're going to build out in a second here. And actually, as a wrapper to this text, I'm just going to create a flexbox. And then on this flexbox, I am going to add some top margin of 6. And we're going to say justify is equal to center. And justify is short for justify content, which is a flexbox property. So just to show what this looks like, let's just change this to be true for a second. So this is what is going to be shown when no users are found. And actually, there's no point in just making this true. We can literally just test this out. So if I search for something like Dua, and we know there are no users with that username, and I click search, no users found. So that seems to be working. Let's come down here and build out this stack. So on the stack, we are going to add a top margin of 6. And inside of the stack, we are going to loop through this users array. And for each one, we are going to return some sort of UI component. So what we want to do is call the map function on the users array. So we can say users.map. And we want to basically take each user and map it or transform it into some sort of UI component. And that UI component is going to be a stack. However, this stack, we are going to make the direction equal to row. So it's going to be a horizontal component, because remember, I said that a stack component is basically a vertically aligned flexbox. We just want to change this to row to make it a horizontally aligned flexbox. And we're using stack instead of flex so that we can take advantage of the spacing that the stack component is going to apply to its child components. So we need to add a bunch of other CSS properties to the stack here. We are going to add an align property of center, and align is short for the flexbox property align items, and we are going to modify the spacing to be 4. We are going to add some Y direction padding. This is going to be a value of 2. We are going to add some X direction padding. This is going to be 4. And we are going to give this a border radius of 4. And all of these styles will make more sense when we actually can see some visuals on the UI in the browser there. Okay, so let's save this so that it formats. And the last CSS property we are going to add is going to be hover state. And I don't think we have done any sort of hover state yet with Chakra. The hover property is a pseudo CSS class. And the way to access pseudo classes is by using underscore. So we can say underscore hover. And then we can pass in an object. And inside of this object, we can basically just apply any sort of CSS properties that we want to be applied when this component is being hovered. In our case, we want to apply a background of white alpha 200. So inside of the stack, let's just temporarily render the user's username like this. So now if I search for something where we know there's going to be users and I click search, it breaks and does not work. What is going on here? Each child is missing a key prop. Okay, so I don't think that's what's, I don't know why this isn't rendering. Oh, it's there. It's just being weird. Okay, so to get rid of this ugly console error, we just need to add a key to our stack component. And this is a React thing. Every time you use the map function in React, you need to give each result a unique key. So we could just use the user's ID as the key here because those are going to be unique. So I'm just going to refresh. And let's go to find or start a conversation, and let's search for Shad. Okay, so it's there. It's just not really rendering. I'm not sure why. Maybe we have to change the the color of the text here. Let's play around with the styling. Okay, so let's take this text and let's wrap it in a text component. So let's put that in here like this. And let's make the color of this equal to white alpha 700. There we go. Okay, so now we have something showing up here. And you can see the hover styling that I am talking about here. So this background of white alpha 200 on hover is being applied. And actually, the first child of this stack is going to be an avatar component. An avatar is like that little kind of profile picture type of thing. So if we say that, that is what the avatar is. And you can pass the avatar a source property with the link to an actual image. In our case, we are not building custom profile picture functionality into our app. So we're just going to leave them blank like this. But if you wanted to add that to the app, that would be a great feature to add custom profile pictures. And then you could make the URL to that picture the value of the source tag for this avatar, and it would display that image. Underneath this avatar, we are going to create a Flex container. And we're actually going to put this text inside of the Flex container. This Flex container, we are going to need to apply some CSS styling. We are going to make the justify value equal to space between. And we are going to give this a width of 100%. And underneath this text, we are going to add the button that the user can click on in order to add this user to the new conversation list. So we can add this button here, and the text in here is going to be select. And I don't think button imported, so import that from Chakra. And the background color we are going to give this is going to be our brand 100, which is our iMessage color. Nice, so that looks really, really nice. And we do not want this default hover behavior that is coming out of the box with the Chakra button. So what we're going to do is on this button, add the hover pseudo class and make the background to be the brand color. So now if we hover it, it's just going to stay the brand color. And if we wanted to center this username vertically, what we can do is on this flex box here, where we have the space between, we can add an align value of center. And that is going to center it vertically. And very shortly here, we are going to be adding a few more props that this component is going to accept. And those props are going to be used down here. One of those props is going to be the function that is actually called when you click on this select button. And that is basically going to add that user to the new conversation list. So for now, what we can do is on this button, just add an onClick function, but just have it do nothing. Just going to be an empty callback function. All right, so let's dive deeper into this select button here and figure out what is actually supposed to happen when we click on this thing. And we're actually going to build out the logic for this onClick function. So basically, when we click on the select button for any particular user in this list, we want to add them to the conversation participants list for this conversation that is about to be created. And so we are going to need to create some sort of state to represent the participants that have been selected. And then when we click on this button here with this onClick function, we are going to add that user to that state. And then we're going to create another UI component down here that is going to show which users have been selected and will be in the newly created conversation. And we are going to create that state inside of the parent of UserSearchList, which is our good old Modal. And the reason we are creating it in here is because we are going to need to share that state among other components within the Modal component here. So in React, when a component has some sort of state, but you need to share that state across other components that live higher up or some sort of sibling component, we need to move that state upwards in the component tree so that we can then pass that state as props to all the sibling components that need it. So that is why we are going to define participants state here. So just underneath our username state here, let's create the state that is going to represent the users that have been selected. So we are going to call this state participants, and the set function is going to be called set participants. Can't seem to type this morning. And then we are going to call our useStateHook and initialize this as an empty array. So when a user opens up the Modal and begins the conversation creation process, it makes sense to have no one inside of the selected participants array. And we can add a type for the state. The type of this is going to be an array of searched users, because this UI component was created from data.searchUsers, which was of type searched user. So each one of these things is a searched user. And so when we click on it, we're just going to add that searched user to this participant state. Therefore, the type of the participant state is an array of searched users. Now let's add the functions that are going to be responsible for adding users to this participant state, as well as removing users from this participant state. And the adding function is what is going to be put into the onClick of this select button here. So come back to our modal here, and let's define a function here called addParticipant. And this is going to take in a user, and the type of this input is going to be searched user. Inside of this function, all we need to do is take this inputted user and add it to this participant state here. So we can just simply say set participants, and we want to take the previous value of participant state and transform this into an array with the entire previous state included, as well as the newly selected user. So basically, we are just taking the previous value of participant state and appending the new user. Okay, and once a user is selected, we are going to clear our username search term, like that. And while we're here, let's define the function for removing a participant. So we could say const remove participant, and this only needs to take in the ID of the user that we are going to be removing. And inside of this function, what we want to do is remove the user with this ID from the participant state. So we can use the JavaScript filter function to do that. So we can call setParticipants, and we can take the previous value of participants, and we want to filter the previous value. And inside of the filter function, we are going to iterate through all of the participants, and we want to filter out the participant that has this ID that was passed into this function. So we can say if p.id does not equal to user ID, then we will let it pass the filter and it will remain in this participants function. So for the participant P that has an ID that matches the user ID, they will be filtered out of the state. Okay, and that is it for this function here. So now we need to pass this addParticipant function to our searchUserList component so that we can actually access it through this button here. So let's come down to UserSearchList and pass that as a prop. addParticipant is going to be equal to our addParticipant function. And we need to go into UserSearchList and declare that on the prop interface. So we can say addParticipant here. And for the type of this function, we need to indicate what arguments this function accepts, as well as what this function returns. So from before, we saw that this function takes in an argument of user. This was of type searched user, and it does not return anything. So we are just going to indicate that it returns void. Now let's destructure this prop here, addParticipant, and add that to our onClick button here. So in this onClick, we want to have a callback function that is going to call that addParticipant function and pass in the user. And so since we are mapping through all of the users in our search results, this entire component is going to be created for each user. And so when we click on a particular button for a specific user, that is the user we are passing in to this function here. Okay, so we don't have a UI component yet to show which users have been added to the participants list, but we can view the state if we go into our React extension. Okay, I'm just going to move this up a bit, and we go to the rendered by section here. We can see that the conversation modal is here. I'm just going to zoom out a bit in the console. And then we can make this a bit smaller. Okay, so we can see this empty array. That is our participant state. And if I click on Shadman, you can see that there now is one object in that array. And if we expand it out a bit, you can see that that object is the search user of Shadman. Okay, so that state is working. So now we need to create a UI component that is going to show all of the users inside of this array. And as part of that new UI component I am talking about, we are going to add the ability to remove a specific user from the list, just in case after the fact you decide you don't want that particular user to be included in the conversation. So let's come back to our modal here. And this new component is going to be a sibling of our user search list. It's just going to sit underneath it. So let's go into our Explorer here. And inside of our modal directory, let's create that component. And this component is going to be called participants. Participants.tsx. Let's do our usual snippet wizardry here. Remove the type and remove the React import. Okay, so let's start off with the props of this component. So this component is going to take in two props. It's going to take in this participants state array so that it can actually show them in the HTML of this component. And it's going to take in that remove participant function, because inside of this component is where we're going to be able to call that function and remove a specific user from that array. So the first one is going to be participants, and this is going to be an array of searched user. And the second prop is going to be that remove participant function. And the type of this is going to be a function that takes in a user ID argument, which is of type string, and does not return anything, so we can declare that as void. Then we can destructure those from the props down here, participants and remove participant. Perfect. Now let's come back to our modal here and add this component into the body here. So just underneath our user search list component, we are going to add in our participants component. Make sure that imports, and we want to pass in participants, which is going to be equal to our participants state, as well as our remove participant function. So remove participant is equal to remove participant. And you can see that the component is showing up there. And we're only going to want to display this component if the participants array actually has stuff in it. And the way we can check that is we can just say, is the participants array dot length not equal to 0? If so, then we want to show that component. And just so we can see the data that is coming in, we can go ahead and log this out. Here are participants. And if I save that, you can see that log is showing up here. So we have the one Shadman user in the array. So now we essentially just need to take this participants array, map through it, and create some sort of HTML component for each one. And the HTML of this component is quite simple. It's only about 20 lines or so. So we can remove this div here. And we are instead going to create a flex container. So make sure that imports. And inside of this flex is where we are going to iterate through all of these participants and create some sort of component for them. So we can say participants.map, and we want to take each individual participant and transform it into a React component. And that React component is going to be our famous stack component from Chakra. This is going to be a row stack though. So we're going to make the direction equal to row, so it is horizontally aligned. Okay, and we're going to add some more CSS properties to both this stack as well as this flex in a second here, but let's just get the data in here. Inside of the stack, we are going to have some text. So import text from Chakra. The text is going to be the participant's username, so participant.username. And then underneath here, we are going to add an icon to remove this user. So it's just going to be like a little X icon. So for the icons in this app, we are going to be using a library called React Icons. It's a great library with pretty much icons for everything you can think of. So if you just search for React Icons and come to this page here, we are going to grab the installation command, copy this, and let's come over to our terminal and make sure we are in our front end directory and just paste that command in there and install React Icons. Perfect. And so the way React Icons works is you can essentially just browse icons literally for anything. So if we just search for like dog, I don't know, anything, all these icons will come up, and then you essentially can click on it and just import it from a specific folder within the React Icons library. In our case, we are looking for like a close button, some sort of X. So if I just search for like close or something, you can see that a ton of icons come, and you can just like pick and choose whichever one you want and then import it in your app. So I think this is the one we're using, iOS close circle something. Okay, so in order to copy the component name, you can just literally click on it and it will copy it for you. And the way we can import that is we can say import from React Icons. And then we have to go into one of the subdirectories here. And the way you can know which subdirectory to go into, because there's so many, is just by the first two letters inside of the actual component name. So in our case, this one here, the first two letters are IO, so we are going to want to use the IO subdirectory. And so the component name, which is the thing we want to import, is that thing we copied when we clicked on this. All right, so now we can add that icon to our code here. And the way to do that is we can just create a React component with that name, IO, iOS closed circle outline, and then we can add any CSS styling we want to these icons as well, which is pretty cool. So if we come back to our app, you can see that we have some stuff showing up here. We have the username as well as the close button, but it's not styled quite like how we want it. So let's make our icon a bit bigger. So we're going to make the size equal to 20. And since it's clickable, we're going to want to make the cursor equal to pointer. Okay, and then on click, this is the thing we are going to click on to remove this participant from the participants list. And so that is where we're going to call our remove participant function. So on click, we can call remove participant, and we want to pass in the specific participant we are iterating through when we're creating this component. Okay, so this is sort of the skeleton of this component. Let's style it a bit further to make it look much better than how it currently looks. So on this stack here, we are going to add an align items of center. So align is equal to center. That is going to center things vertically. And then we are going to give this a background of white alpha 200. And we're going to give this a border radius of 4 and a padding of 2. There we go. That's looking pretty good. And then on this outermost flex component, we want to add some top margin. So we can say MT is equal to 8, and that's going to space it out a little bit. And then we are going to add a property called gap, which is going to add some spacing between all of the child components. And we're going to make this equal to 10 pixels. And to demonstrate what this looks like, let's add another user. So let's search for our lol dude user and add him in there. You can see that that 10 pixel gap is this thing here. If we were to remove that, you can see they're just touching each other, which we don't want. It looks kind of gross. So let's add the gap in there. And basically that's how a stack works. Remember I was talking about how a stack evenly spaces its children. Under the hood, the stack component is just using CSS gap. So yeah, I wanted to show you kind of both methods of doing things so that you learn a little bit about CSS as well. And we are just going to add one last property to this flex, and this is going to be flex wrap, and the value of this is going to be wrap. Basically what this does is if the content of this container exceeds the width of the container, it's just going to like wrap it and create like another row underneath it rather than just have it go off the screen infinitely. So if we added like a bunch more users to this participants list, without this, they would just kind of like go off the screen. With the flex wrap, it's going to be like, oh, okay, well, if I add this other one, it's actually going to go outside of the container. So let's create a new row underneath. Oh, okay. And actually down here, TypeScript is complaining because we have not passed in the correct argument to our remove participant function. We are not supposed to pass in the entire participant. We are only supposed to pass in the ID of the participant. Okay, so now if I click on this X thing, it should remove it, which it does. Perfect. So I can add them back in, remove, select, remove. Nice. So that state seems to be working. Okay, and let's just briefly add our key prop to our stack component here, since we are inside of a map function, and we will just make that the participant ID. So now that we have a way for our users to select the participants they want as part of their new conversation, we want to start to think about how we are actually going to create this conversation. And so just underneath here, we are going to create a button that is actually going to fire off the createConversation mutation. Okay, so I'm just going to remove this console log here. And let's go back to our modal and start to create that button. And we are going to put this new createConversation button inside of this condition as well, because we only want this button to be visible if there are indeed selected participants. So we're just going to make it a sibling of this participants component here. Now, in order to add multiple components inside of this part of the JSX here, we are going to need to create a React fragment. So we can wrap our participants in that fragment. And the reason we need to create a fragment is because all JSX components must have some sort of parent. So if I got rid of this fragment here, just as we had before, and I tried to add like another component in here, it's going to freak out. And if you hover over it, it's going to say JSX expressions must have one parent element. And so that is why we create these fragments to act as that parent element. This fragment doesn't necessarily have to be a fragment. It could be a div, a box, any sort of container parent element. I just like to use fragments if there isn't any extra styling that has to be applied to the parent element, because the fragment is essentially just kind of like a dummy HTML component. It doesn't really exist in the DOM. And sometimes if you have like a bunch of divs everywhere like this, that are just there, that don't really have any styling applied to them or anything, they can conflict with your CSS a little bit. So I just like to use fragments to prevent any sort of CSS conflicts, unless I'm applying some sort of styling to the parent component. Anyway, that's a little JSX quick tip there. So now we can add siblings to this participants component, and this sibling we are going to add is going to be a Chakra button, and this button is going to say create conversation. So we need to make this look a little bit better. It's kind of looking slightly off. So what we can do is add a background. We want the color of this to be our brand 100 iMessage color. We are going to add a width of 100%, so it spans the entire container. We are going to give this a top margin of 6 to space it out a little bit. And to override the default Chakra hover styling, we're just going to add our own hover styling, and we just want to make the background be maintained as the brand 100 color. And we're also going to add the disabled prop and the is loading prop once we actually create the create conversation mutation. So we will come back to those. The last thing I'm going to add here for now is going to be our onClick prop, and I'm just going to make this an empty callback for a second here. But let's come up here and create the function that is going to be called when we click this button. At the very top, let's define a function called onCreateConversation. And this is going to need to be an asynchronous function because we're going to be using the await keyword to await some asynchronous API requests. And inside of this function, we are going to create a try-catch block that is going to help us with our error handling for our asynchronous operations. So inside of our catch block, let's just add a quick console log that's going to say onCreateConversation error, and then log the error. Okay, there's a little typo here. And then also we can display an error to our user using React.toast. So we can import toast and then call the error function. And then inside of here, we can just pass the error message as the string. And to make sure TypeScript doesn't want to kill us, let's just add the type of any there. And very shortly here, when we create the createConversation mutation, I'm going to show you another way you can handle errors with Apollo, but I'll speak more about that when we get to it. Okay, so we have not created this mutation yet, but it is inside of our try block where we are going to call that mutation. So I'm just going to add a comment here that says createConversation mutation. So what we are going to do now is go back to our backend and set it up so that this createConversation mutation actually exists on our API. And once that's all set up, once we've created the typeDefs and the resolver, and our API is actually able to accept that type of mutation, we will come back to our front end and start to work on the actual mutation request using the useMutation hook. Okay, so let's switch our attention to our backend for a little bit here. So in the Explorer here, let's go to our source and then let's go to our index typeDefs file here. Okay, so we can see that currently we only have our user typeDefs inside of our typeDefs array here. So we're going to need to add our conversation typeDefs in the same fashion we added our user typeDefs to this main typeDefs array. And we are going to need to do the exact same thing with our resolvers, because right now we only have user resolvers. We need to add our conversation resolvers as well so that they're actually added to our GraphQL schema. And it looks like we have created these files already from before. They are empty though, so we're going to need to go ahead and populate these files. So let's start off with our conversation resolvers here. Let's create our conversation resolvers object. And just exactly like we did with our user resolvers, we are going to have these three sections: query, mutations, and later subscriptions as well. So let's close this. Inside of this object, let's create our query section as well as our mutation section. And later we will come back and add subscriptions, but just to prevent that GraphQL schema error, we're not going to put subscriptions in here for now. Okay, so right now we're actually going to be focusing on the createConversation mutation. And then once that's successfully built, we will then work on the conversations query to get the user's conversations. But for now, I'm just going to remove query as well, actually, just so that we don't get any schema errors, because we're going to be focusing only on this mutation for now. So our first mutation that we're going to create is going to be this createConversation mutation. And for now, I'm just going to make this an empty asynchronous function, just like this, so that it actually is just defined. And then at the very bottom of the file here, let's default export our resolvers object. Then inside of our index.ts resolvers file, we can come up to the top here and import conversation resolvers from that conversations file, like that. And then in order to add our conversation resolvers to our GraphQL schema, all we need to do is just add it to this merged object here, just like that. So the boilerplate of our conversation resolvers is all nicely set up. We'll come back and build out the logic of this function later. For now, I'm just going to close this file. Okay, so now let's go into our conversation typeDefs file. So we can create our conversation typeDefs GraphQL string. So we can say typeDefs is equal to GQL and import GQL from Apollo Server Core. And then we can add the backticks here. And then at the very bottom here, let's just do our export default typeDefs. Then inside of our index.ts typeDefs file, we can do the exact same thing with our conversation typeDefs. So we can say import conversation typeDefs from the conversation file, and then add that to this array. Okay, so let's come back to our conversation typeDefs object here and add in our createConversation mutation. So I'm just going to close the directory here. So it's been a little while since we have created a type definition. So just as a reminder, to declare a mutation, we want to use the type keyword and then the mutation keyword. And then inside of here is where we're going to declare the actual mutation name. So this mutation is going to be called createConversation. And this is going to take in an argument of participant IDs. So essentially, when we are creating a conversation, all we need to know is who is in this conversation. And so the way we are going to know that is just through a list of participant IDs that have been selected on the front end by the conversation creator. So we can call this argument participant IDs, and this is going to be just an array of strings. So we can declare that like this. And this mutation is going to return an object with just the newly created conversation ID inside of it. Okay, so this is going to be returned to our front end, and then our front end is going to use this new conversation ID with the NextJS router to route the user to the new conversation page using that ID. And that will become more clear once we actually get back to our front end and are able to actually fire this mutation off. But as you remember, we cannot declare a return type like this in GraphQL query strings. We need to declare a separate return type with this structure. So just underneath our mutation here, let's create a new type called createConversationResponse. So it's going to have a conversation ID, which is going to be of type string. Then up here, we can declare the return type of our createConversation mutation to be our createConversationResponse, just like that. So that should be syntactically correct. Let's see if our server is alive. Okay, so it is. So we have no syntax errors, and our server is up and running, and it looks like we have been able to add our conversation mutations and typeDefs to our GraphQL schema. So this is all we're going to need inside of our conversation typeDefs file for now. We're going to come back later when we build on more features, but for now we can close this out. One thing I just wanted to actually add in our createConversation resolver function is just a console log inside createConversation. I pretty much do this every single time I create a new resolver. I just like to make sure that the front end is actually able to hit this part of the backend with console logs first before actually building out the logic of this function. Okay, so now we can go back to our front end because our backend has now been successfully set up to take in that type of mutation request. So now we need to make our front end actually perform that request. Okay, so for now, let's close this file here and come back to our Modal and work on that mutation. Okay, so from our front end, in order to call our createConversation mutation, we are going to need to define a query string for that mutation. All right, so let's go to our Explorer here and into GraphQL operations. And so just like our user operation file, where we have all of our query strings defined, we are going to need to create a file for our conversation operations. So let's go ahead and do that. So inside of this operations folder, let's create a file called conversation.ts. And exactly like the structure of our user file here, we are going to just export an object with these three sections on it. So let's close this and let's do export default, this object queries with mutations as well as subscriptions. Creating a conversation is a mutation. So let's come into our mutation section here and define that query string. So the name of our query string is going to be createConversation, and we are going to write this out using GQL from Apollo client. So we can add that and add the backticks. And since we are creating a mutation, we want to use the mutation keyword. And the name of our mutation can be createConversation. And so as we just saw a few minutes ago, this mutation is just going to take in a single argument of participant IDs. So let's declare that using our $sign here. And we can say participant IDs. And this is going to be an array of strings. And let's use the bang operator here to make it a required argument. Just going to close the directory so we have a bit more room. Then we can open up a set of curly brackets here. And inside of here, we can indicate what resolver we actually want to hit on our backend. And that resolver is called createConversation. And we want to pass in our participant IDs argument here. So we can say participant IDs. And the value of this is going to be the passed in participant IDs array. And then we can indicate what we want to receive back from this createConversation mutation. And again, if we go back to our conversation typeDefs, we saw that we were returning an object with the conversation ID inside of it. Okay, so on our front end, we need to indicate to our GraphQL API that we do indeed want that field back. So all we need to do is just say give me the conversation ID back from this mutation. Awesome. So that is it for this query string. And before we go back to our modal and actually bring in the useMutation hook, let's go to our util types file and declare the TypeScript types that are going to represent our inputs as well as the data we receive back for our createConversation mutation. So this is the first type we are creating that is not user related. So what I'm going to do is just add a comment above all of these. It's just going to say users. And then underneath here, we can create another comment that just says conversation, just so that this file is a bit more organized and we can kind of see sections for specific entities here. And you could go ahead and create a separate types file for each entity if you would like. I figured just to put it in a single file is probably fine, just because we don't have an insane amount of types for each entity here. It's just a preference on how you like to organize your code. Okay, so the first interface we're going to define is going to be the structure of the data we are going to receive back from our createConversation mutation. So let's say export interface, and we can call this createConversation data. And so that mutation is going to return an object with the name of our mutation as the key. So we can say createConversation, and inside of here, we are going to have that conversation ID of the newly created conversation, which we just saw in the typeDefs as well. And underneath here, let's define the interface for our inputs. So we can say export interface createConversation input. And we just saw that this is going to take in an array of participant IDs. So we can say participant IDs, and this is just going to be an array of strings. And I just want to mention this one more time. I'm just going to split screen this types file here with our conversation operations file. I just want to make sure this is a clear concept. Okay, so as I've mentioned a few times, we need to create TypeScript types that model our GraphQL types. So this TypeScript type that we see here for participant IDs being an array of strings, this is the TypeScript equivalent of this here. And I really want to just emphasize this because this is something I found confusing when I started writing GraphQL apps in TypeScript specifically, because I'm just like, why do you need these types if GraphQL has the types? And yeah, again, TypeScript is just a developer tool that helps make our code more robust and helps us as developers understand what's going on in the structure of our data. And so that is why we create TypeScript types to reflect our GraphQL types. So yeah, hopefully I'm not unnecessarily repeating myself with that concept, but that was something that was kind of confusing to me, so I just wanted to emphasize it once again. So now we have some types that we can use to make our createConversation mutation request type safe. So let's close this file here and come back to our modal. And now let's bring in the useMutation hook and actually use this createConversation query string as an input. Okay, so in our modal here, just underneath our searchUsers_LazyQuery, let's define that mutation. So our useMutation hook is going to return an array. So we can say empty array is equal to useMutation, and the argument to this is going to be our createConversation mutation string. So we need to come up to the top here and actually import our conversation operations, just like we did with our user operations here. So I'm going to duplicate this line and change this to conversation operations, and the file we want to import that from is our conversation operations file. Okay, and this is freaking out at us, but that's okay. Let's come back down to the hook here, and we can pass that in as an argument now. So we can say conversation operations dot mutations dot create conversation. So this useMutation hook is going to return this array, and the first thing in that array is going to be the actual JavaScript function that we are going to call to execute this mutation. And the second thing in the array is going to be that object with our data, loading, and error parameters inside of it. And so we're having some naming conflicts with our useLazyQuery variables up here. Okay, and actually we're not going to need data or error returned from our hook because we are going to get those two things down here when we call this createConversation function. If you remember, I said that if you call that function that the hook gives you, createConversation, that is going to also return data and errors. So yeah, we don't really need to grab them from up here. So we're just going to have loading up here so that we can use that in our createConversation button. So let's alias this name, loading, to be createConversation loading. Okay, and since we're on the topic, let's use this parameter here in the button down here. So in our create conversation button, let's add is loading, and the value of this we want to be create conversation loading. So we actually have defined our onCreateConversation function, and so we can pass that to our onClick of this button here. So onClick, we want to call onCreateConversation. So when we click on the button, onCreateConversation is going to be called, which is this, and then that is going to fire off the mutation by calling this function here. And one last thing we need to do with our useMutation hook here is just pass in those types we defined for our input and data. So the first type argument is going to be our createConversation data, and the second one is going to be createConversation input. And so make sure those two things import from our typesUtil file up here. Okay, so let's come down to our onCreateConversation function, and we can remove this comment because we actually now have a function to call thanks to our useMutation hook. So our function is going to return an object, and we want to await this function because it is asynchronous. So we want to say await create conversation, and inside of it, we want to pass in the variables that we have defined in our input type here. And so thanks to TypeScript, we are able to see what the required inputs are here. And so TypeScript is saying that the participant's ID argument is missing on our variables object here. So if I go inside of here, we get autocomplete there thanks to TypeScript. So hopefully now you're starting to see some of the really nice benefits you get with TypeScript. Okay, so the type of our participant IDs array is an array of strings. And so right now I'm just going to pass an empty array because we don't actually currently have a defined array that we can pass here. So I'm just going to make it empty. So that is something we need to do. We need to create this participant IDs array. Okay, so we currently have this state called participants, and I'm just going to open up the modal here and search for a user so that we actually have some visuals going on. So this participants array is allowing us to track who has been selected as participants in this conversation. So search for another user to make this even more clear. So currently we have loldude and shadman inside of this participants array, but the type of both loldude and shadman in this array are search users. So they have the ID and the username. But for our create conversation mutation, we are only passing in an array of those IDs. We don't really care about the usernames. We only care about the IDs. So there is a bit of a type mismatch here, and we cannot just simply pass in our participants array as our participant IDs because the types do not align, and TypeScript is telling us that here. Okay, so basically all we need to do is transform this participants array of search users into an array of user IDs. We are going to do that inside of our onCreateConversation function here. So as soon as this function is called, we're just going to take this participants array and transform it into an array of the user IDs of all the users that are in that array. So at the very top here, let's create a variable called participant IDs. And all we're going to do is take our participants array and transform it into an array of a different structure. So we are going to use our JavaScript map function. Inside of this map function, we are just going to iterate through all of our participants, which are of type searched user. And we just want to transform it from a searched user into just an ID. And this is how we can do that. And then down here, we can just simply say this due to JavaScript shorthand notation. So this defined array here is going to be passed as the value here. And now the types are all lined up because we have taken our search user participants array and transformed it into an array of user IDs, which are of type string. So TypeScript is happy, but there is one small logical problem that we need to fix here. This participant IDs array currently does not include ourselves, right? So I've selected loldude and shadman to be participants in this conversation. But if I were to go ahead and create this conversation with this current code, I would not be including myself in the conversation, which is sort of problematic. And I'm pretty sure that that's pretty important. When you create a conversation with someone else, you want to include yourself in that conversation. So basically, all we need to do is just make a very minor modification to this line here to include ourselves inside of that array. And so to do that, all we need to do is somehow get access to the currently signed in user's ID and just add it to this array. And thanks to our NextAuth user session, this is going to be extremely easy. Okay, so our modal is currently being rendered by, I think, ConversationList. Yes, so our conversation modal is in here. And we are already passing the session as a prop to ConversationList. So let's go ahead and forward that session prop as a prop to our conversation modal, and then we can just access the user's ID directly from there. Inside our conversation list, inside of the props here, let's destructure session. And then on our conversation modal, let's just pass that as the first prop. So we can say session is equal to session. And then let's come to our modal and declare that on the modal props interface here. And you could also call the useSession hook directly inside of this component as well, if you would like. That's another way you could access the session. You don't necessarily have to pass it as a prop, but I figured that since we are already passing it to the parent of the modal, it's quite simple to just pass it as a prop. Which one of those things you do in this situation doesn't really matter, but I'm just going to go ahead and continue passing it as a prop. So I'm going to say session, and this is going to be of type session. So make sure the type imports from NextAuth because there's a ton of other ones here. And then on our props, we can destructure that down here. And then at the very top of our component here, let's destructure the user ID from that session. So we want to destructure the user, and then we want to destructure the ID. And I'm just going to alias the name of this to be user ID so that it's a bit more clear. Okay, and then down here on line 56, for our participant IDs array, what we're going to do is take this mapped array here and wrap it with another array. And then we're going to spread the mapped array to kind of get the inner contents. And then at the front, we're just going to add our own user ID. So now this participant IDs array contains ourselves as well as all of the other users that we have selected. And that is the array that is being passed to our backend. Okay, so inside of the object that this function is going to return, let's destructure the data here. And we're just going to console log this data. Here is data. Okay, so now let's try firing off this mutation and see if our front end can successfully communicate with our createConversation backend resolver. And before we do that, I'm just going to go to our conversation resolvers here. Okay, and inside of this console log here, let's actually log the value of the participant IDs argument so that we can kind of visualize what this is going to look like. And so first, we just need to quickly declare the arguments that are going to be passed to this resolver. So like usual, we do not care about the parent argument, so we're just going to declare that as an underscore of type any. Next, we can declare our args, and the type of our args is going to have that array of participant IDs. Participant IDs is going to be an array of strings, and then our third one is going to be our context, which is going to be of type GraphQL context. And VS Code is doing that weird thing where it does not want to auto import a type. So let's come to the top and import our GraphQL context from our util type file. Util/types GraphQL context. Okay. Why is this still not happy? Oh, okay. I think it's because I'm just missing a curly bracket here. There we go. And so on this console log, let's just also log args so we can see the value of our participant ID's input. Okay, so let's come back to our modal here. And I think we're good to go. I think we can just simply fire this off. We have our loading state set up, and we're currently not returning anything from this resolver. So we're probably just going to get undefined back or something, but that's okay. I just want to show you that we're actually passing the participant IDs as an argument here. Okay, so let's fire this off. Okay, yeah, so here is data is showing that we just have null because we are not returning anything like I just said. But if we go to our server logs here, you can see that we are seeing that log with the participant IDs. So one of these is us, I don't know which one, and then the other two are loldude and shadman's IDs. And this is perfect because now on our backend, we have all of the information we need to be able to successfully create the new conversation entity in our database. All right, you guys, I think I'm going to leave it there for part 2. I'm going to try creating smaller parts as compared to part 1, just so I can release them on a more frequent basis for you guys. And we have made a lot of headway in this video. We've hopefully become a lot more comfortable with GraphQL and TypeScript, and we have built a ton of React components, and we have pretty much completed the entire conversation creation process. And in the next video, we are going to cover some really exciting things like database design and how we are going to model our data and the relationships between them. And we're also going to start working on the sending of messages functionality. And we're going to dive very heavily into the real-time functionality with GraphQL subscriptions. And I'm hoping to release part 3 sometime over the next 4 days to a week or so. I'm going to try to really speed up up the development here. All right, so that is it for part 2. Let me know if you have any feedback in the comments below. If you did enjoy this video, please give it a like. It really does help out the channel. I really appreciate it. And subscribe if you would like to. And also, please join my Discord server. The link is in the description. I would love to see you in there. Thank you guys so much for watching. Take care. I will see you in the next one.